Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's discussion. So we'd like to invite you to consider your vision for the future. And so we're going to be covering three topics of discussion today. And the first one is crystallizing our vision. The second one is responding proactively to obstacles that are obscuring our vision. And the third area that we're wanting to talk about is getting ready to take steps to repair and prepare our boats for this journey ahead. So let's start with vision. How can we define vision, and how can we think about it in a useful way that will help us during this period of time we find ourselves in right now?
So I think one way to think of vision is the way we see things, the lens through which we see the world. And obviously we will talk about the vision of the future and kind of where we're headed, but potentially it's quite important to look at how are we viewing the world right now? What is our vision of the current? There's a tendency to be quite overly focused on just the negative. I've also come across some people that are just in the optimistic, everything's fine, look at the opportunities, this too shall pass. And I think there's something about a realistic view that helps us cope through turbulent times, which is being able to weigh both the negatives and be realistic and give ourselves a chance to experience it, which is what I think we spoke a bit about in the last session. And then having an optimistic view of the future, but being able to almost hold both and really looking at how are we framing things at the moment? What's the stories we're telling ourselves about our experiences and about what's happening around the world? And is there opportunity to maybe reframe some of the things we're saying to ourselves or that we're hearing?
I think we have to remind ourselves that our sense of a vision, whether it's a vision for the next 5 years of my life or 10 years of my life, is still a reflection of ourselves. So it's almost a projection of ourselves into the future. So ultimately our vision is just another perspective of a version of myself that I feel I'm working towards. So I suppose the question for me when we think about vision and when we want to clarify this idea of our vision is to ask ourselves, what version of myself do I want to be? What values will be at the core of that version of myself? In relationships, what values will be at the core of that version of myself in terms of work, in terms of family, in terms of the things that I value in life? It's not necessarily related to material things or the things that we will be doing necessarily, but I think we should also start by just asking ourselves, how do we align ourselves with a version of ourselves that we feel is worth striving for?
Another psychology concept that I feel relates to this is about your real self versus your ideal self. Your real self is where you currently are now. Stop, reflect, and that's going to guide you on where you want to be in the future. And that ideal self, just like you said, Dave, is really about your family, your career, your relationships with others, what values you're bringing to the table. So this idea of vision is really, it's twofold. It's present and future oriented.
I grabbed this book off my bookshelf and I was paging through it. So it's Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective Families, which is a very, really good book. And there's a sentence here that reads as follows: vision is greater than baggage, in inverted commas, greater than the negative baggage of the past and even the accumulated baggage of the present. And so tapping into the sense of vision gives you the power and the purpose to rise above the baggage and act based on what really matters most. And I think that also reflects what all of you are saying, is it's about those values. And that sense of vision is an invitation to look ahead, to look currently and ahead, but to look at what our values are and to to know and to choose that supersedes whatever baggage, whatever troubles that we've got right now.
I guess we could say, Mark, that our vision is almost our motivation as to where we want to be in life.
I think what's so important in what I'm hearing from this conversation is one of my favorite sayings is, wherever you go, there you are. And so I suppose what we're saying is you can set your sights on this vision and kind of have this ideal future of what's important and who you want to become and how you want to be in the world and the relationships. But if you're not working on who you are now, then you're going to take this with you. And so part of, I guess, the invitation, which you were referring to, Mark, is saying, what's the baggage here? What's the baggage you've brought? Use this opportunity to look at it, to unpack the baggage, to decide what do you want to take with you forward? What are some of the things you can let go of? And what's most important, so that you can start stepping into this different vision of, or ideal vision of who you want to be.
I think we need to make that connection with how honest we are looking at our lives right now, because that informs what our motivations are for change. I think basing our ideal self, or that vision we have of an ideal self, on our current situation, or more specifically, aspects in our current relationships that we are unhappy about, aspects in our sense of purpose, in our work life, in our family life, in our personal life. Those are things that we need to be aware of. That informs this process of change that leads to this vision that we're working towards.
You know, when we're talking about crystallizing our vision, as I'm listening to everyone, I'm asking myself, is it possible to crystallize our vision? Is it useful? And I guess as I'm asking that, I'm asking, should the emphasis be on crystallizing the vision, or should it be on, working on it and reviewing it and being in tune with it? Because having the tension between being aware of the current and where we're wanting to move towards is always contingent on our current sense of awareness. And so we are hoping that as we progress, that we're going to be developing, we're going to be learning, we're going to be upskilling ourselves. And so I guess there's the hope that our visions and our view of the future is going to somewhat modify. But again, that's where I think it comes back to values, doesn't it? It's principles and values that probably should be there guiding you, and not necessarily just the one or two separate goals that might change and the way it looks over time. But it's the values and the goals. Do you think so? Do you think vision then is something that we need to be, anchoring down as a hard and fast rule, or is it something we need to be reviewing and discussing?
I love that question, because I think it's not something that's bedded down and nailed to the ground. Because I think, if anything, COVID's shown us you could have had very set goals for 2020 or, for the next 2 years, whatever, and COVID has totally thrown those open. So I think in setting a vision, it's not something that's hard and fast. It's something that we have to continuously check in. And does this still fit with the person I am, the person I want to be? And I think what comes to mind in answering that question is, we have a choice to either have our lives unfold by default or by design. And I suppose before COVID, we were kind of on this default, it almost feels like on this default railroad to a train crash for many people. It was just this rushing. And I suppose what we were saying last time as well is that COVID has given an opportunity to push the pause button. And in this conversation about Visionology and looking forward, we're getting an opportunity to, by design, have a look at who do we want to be, how do we want to show up in the world. And a question I often ask my clients in my practice when we're talking about their kind of ideal future or where they see themselves is exactly what we've been saying, less about what do you want to be earning, where do you want to be living, what do you want to be driving, but more how do you want to be feeling. So if you think about the end of every day or at the end of every week, when you're going into bed and you're reflecting on your day or your week, what do you want to say about your life? What do you want to be feeling about how you've shown up, what impact you've had, who you are in relationship with? And I think that's a lovely thing to keep asking in terms of setting our vision, because it keeps it fluid and keeps it meaningful and tied to what's important to us.
I don't think we can be static in this. We have to be fluid because our values are always changing. Our situation in our personal life is changing. Our external contextual factors are constantly changing. So as much as we want to be forward looking, we also need to be realistic. And I think this sense of taking it, not setting it in stone, should we say, it almost helps us to avoid disappointments, because that allows us that fluidity to constantly change it or adjust it as we need. But I think we also run the risk of, I've seen it in clients of mine in my practice where, like Lauren said, it's not by our choice where our life has become like that. And if we maintain that notion of our vision, our visionology, we are creating for ourselves, but that also means that we have responsibility to change it when we need to change it. And we can't just say, this wasn't my fault, or, life is throwing this at me. Sure, life might throw something at you, but it's how you respond to that that's important. And I think that this idea of us constantly evolving and this pause button that COVID has given us has really allowed us to now say, well, right, let's reevaluate and let's see how we need to adjust that vision, because otherwise we probably would just continue on the path that we were on before COVID.
As I'm listening to what you all saying, I'm kind of thinking we're very blessed in South Africa to be able to view the stars we do the way we do. Depending on where you are in South Africa, in some places you have the most magnificent view of the skies than anywhere in the world. And it kind of makes me think that there's three types of people when we talk about vision. Looking up at the skies, one person might think to himself, it is what it is. Then you have a second person who might look up at the stars and absolutely marvel at it, without any comprehension of what they're actually looking at. The third person is the person that look up at the skies, see the stars, marvel at the beauty, but also sees a navigational instrument. I think we need to tell ourselves that our approach to a vision should inspire some sense of excitement. Our vision of our future should leave us with some sense of direction. And I think to pick up on what you all said, I don't think our vision is a destination. Obviously, if we use the stars to help us navigate, we're not aiming at reaching the stars. We're merely using the stars to give us a sense of direction.
I love that. So it sounds like, we can't abandon this whole idea of vision because it's so far out there, and, we're going to avoid getting anchored in it. But it is an invitation for us to imbue a sense of purpose and a sense of direction that can call us forward, call us above and beyond our current circumstances. And I think that is exciting. And I think that the fact that as human beings, we have the capacity to envisage something better, something different, it's pretty much unique to us as a species. And I think it's a gift. It's often used to generate anxiety because of the way people project themselves into the future. But if we can channel that into a sense of optimism, into a sense of hope, then we can derive the benefit that skill and that asset allows us to tap into.
Maybe we should ask ourselves what informs our sense of direction. You said earlier, Mark, that we'll be talking about proactively dealing with the obstacles that obscure our vision. I think if we're saying that our vision should leave us with a sense of direction, but that version of ourselves that we're working towards is in some way also just a version of ourselves, very much based on where we are right now. Then the question I have in my mind is, if we think of our current situation, what informs this process of building our vision? What informs our sense of direction? What are the things in our lives right now that actually helps us move in the direction that we want to go? And so maybe we're getting to a point where we need to talk about what those obstacles are. And obstacles aren't necessarily only things that makes it difficult for us to see the future, to see our own futures, but it could also be the things that steer us in the wrong direction, that in some way alienates us from this ideal version of ourselves.
I love that question, and I think, Dave, what comes up for me immediately is something that you actually mentioned in one of our earlier conversations, is I think something that can get in our way is this negative emotional infection rate. I remember you saying we need to watch the emotional infection rate, not just the physical infection rate. And I think there's so much negativity around, and it can be impacting people's ability to believe in the possibility of a different future, or their capability of even moving towards their vision, because there is so much out there that makes it feel all doom and gloom, and all hope is lost. And especially now, I was reading an article recently around the second wave, not of the physical infection rate, but the second wave of mental health impact, where people are just feeling helpless, hopeless, exhausted, even a bit cynical and sarcastic by what's happened. And I think that negativity in ourselves can be a blockage, and especially if we're being infected by others or infecting others, I think it can really get in our way of feeling hopeful, or feeling like a different future is even possible right now.
So, Lauren, it sounds like there's a positive vote there for not only social distancing from a physical perspective, but social media distancing. I think we need to distance ourselves from all of the negative media that is attached. It doesn't mean that we must be uninformed, but we need to just take care of ourselves. And sometimes the barrage of information, some of which may be conspiracy theory, it really just takes us down a rabbit hole, and it clutters our sense of mental wellness.
I love how you use that sense of social media, Mark. I think, that interest, which we spoke about also in the first session, was that as a people, as a society, we're so desperate to control. So we need to gather all the information, but ultimately we end up creating that anxiety in us, that angst in us, where we now can't sleep, where we now can't think clearly. And that will obviously affect or be an obstacle to how we then change how we see ourselves, or how it'll influence our vision going forward. Something else we've mentioned so many times, but I think it needs to be mentioned again: your values. Where are you getting your values from? Your relationships with people can also be an obstacle. I just think off the top of my head now, if you're surrounded by those negative people, chances are you're not going to be motivated to come up with this idea of vision for yourself. You're going to have people constantly putting you down. You're going to have people making you feel like you're worthless, like you cannot change anything about yourself. So it's really about surrounding yourself with supportive relationships that assist.
I like the idea that it's possible for us to just cancel out our overexposure to how bad news is being reported on in the mainstream media and social media. But unfortunately, in my experience, that's not always possible. I mean, we did say in our previous discussions how important it is for us to maintain a meaningful sense of connection with the people that are close to us. And unfortunately, you might have a very crystallized idea of what you want to expose yourself to and not, but that doesn't go for everyone else in your life. So you have the random conversation with Auntie Susie, or your mother or your father or a grandmother, or or any other family member that's very immersed in the news. So I think one of those obstacles that we need to be aware of that obscures our vision that obscures that meaningful vision of the future is a lack of self-awareness. Sometimes we cannot filter out negative information. And in that case, it's very important for us to be honest with ourselves about how we feel affected by it. To give ourselves permission to feel that sense of being overwhelmed, in order for us to not just acknowledge it, but act on it. Whether it is by setting healthy boundaries in relationships, whether it is by preparing someone in advance, even before a conversation starts, what space you're in and what you would like to talk about or would like to avoid talking about. I think we are sometimes overly cautious about hurting people's feelings, and yes, now more than ever before, we need to be empathetic, and we need to give people permission to share their feelings with us. Ultimately, if we do it at the expense of our own ability to cope and manage, then we're not doing ourselves, or anyone else for that matter, any favors.
I read an article recently, and it was about some of the triggers that cause distress in our lives, and it's really around COVID. But I think some of the factors for me which can cause distress can ultimately affect our vision as well. So I've just got it up on my screen here, and I just want to go through some of them, and I think some of them are also an eye-opener. So they have got things like a perception of increased risk, things like poor sleep. I mean, it's such a simple thing, and people think that this doesn't affect them, but poor sleep might affect how you see yourself going forward. Sedentary behavior, changes in your eating habits, changes in technology use, chronic stress, irritability and conflict, increased media consumption, existential concerns. And I think, those are factors that can ultimately also be an obstacle to our vision going forward.
Exactly, and I think that's a point for all of us to consider and ask ourselves: are we sleeping correctly? Are we eating healthily? Are we actually exercising? And they seem such simple, basic concepts, but you know what? We've got to get it back to basics, because you're correct. Those very things that are within our control can be the very barriers that we're not working on in order to then release that potential that we've got to be moving forward.
I think another barrier, which is not very commonly spoken about, but I have had conversations with clients and family members. For some people, this has actually been a really incredible experience, the whole COVID thing. And they have actually thrived, their families thrived, their businesses thrived, they've actually loved it. And I think in conversation with those people, there's some sense of, like, I guess in trauma language, you would call it survivor's guilt. Like, they feel guilty that they're actually doing so okay, and that they're actually experiencing some level of joy. And I guess if you're not aware of that, that could also kind of be a barrier to you fulfilling your own vision and your own kind of sense of where you want to go, if you're kind of feeling guilty for the fact that you're actually coping quite well and actually doing maybe better than before COVID. And so I suppose it's also about acknowledging it, and if that is you, giving yourself the permission to say there's nothing wrong with being okay during this time, even if other people are really struggling. It's not an either or. You can both be incredibly kind of aware and empathic to what's going on for other people, and incredibly grateful for the fact that you're experiencing something different. And I guess that word permission is really important to help us move forward and move towards what we're wanting to achieve for ourselves.
When we talk about dealing with the obstacles that obscure our vision, I think we can talk for days about what those actual things are that we need to be aware of. Overexposure to social media, lack of self-awareness, survivor's guilt. but I'm thinking that maybe we should also consider our approach to obstacles. It kind of leaves me with the sense that we all, to a certain degree, are aware of our limitations, our current limitations. Irrespective of your level of self-awareness, if we are honest with ourselves, we can all identify some of those in our lives. The question is, with what tenacity are we approaching it? You know, Janelle, you were mentioning those that list of things that we could see as obstacles. You know, for example, sleeping difficulties. Once we become aware of a limitation or a problem that we're currently facing that we feel might derail us from reaching our sense of future vision, with what tenacity do we approach it? Do we approach it with a sense of complacency, or do we take it seriously and tell ourselves that this is something that I need to actually plan strategically? You know, Mark was saying in our last discussion that we should write things down. How does this conversation and this approach to obstacles materialize on paper? Do we do that? And if we haven't sat down and made a list of those challenges that I need to be aware of and overcome, how seriously are we taking it?
Yeah, it's that concept, I think, of learned helplessness comes up for me when you're saying that as well. Is, you know, that some people may have just bought into the idea that I can't change, and so it's all very well to listen to you guys, you psychologists, talking about writing things down, and you know, things can be different, and there are possibilities for the future, but maybe they don't believe that, and so that needs to be challenged. You know, that needs to be challenged from a logic perspective. It's irrational to believe that. You know, there are always ways that we can respond to whatever stimulus that comes across. And I think Lauren made reference to Viktor Frankl in a previous discussion, and about that, you know, whatever does happen, whatever difficult circumstances do happen, we have the ability to choose how we're going to respond to that. And so people need to know that. They need to first recognize that they have a choice, acknowledge it. But then, as you say, Dave, they need to have that grit to carry it to the next level and write it down, anchor it down, so that it doesn't get lost in the busyness of life, in the confusion of emotions that go up and down. Actually, I'm reminded of a quote. It's quite a humorous quote by Zig Ziglar, a motivational speaker. And he said that people often say that motivation doesn't last. Well, neither does bathing. That's why we recommend it daily. And I think that's the thing is, you know, we need to do this motivational thing daily. We need to remind ourselves daily that we've got stuff to work on, that life could be better, that the obstacles can be chipped away at, and it's that sense of grit and tenacity that needs to be there. And Lauren, those people that are going well and they've got everything under control and finances are flourishing and everything, maybe they need to take this on board, and they need to find those others, the family members, the friends that are struggling, and they need to be that external source of reassurance, keeping people accountable, keeping them motivated, so that they can carry things forward, and they can feel a sense of purpose in this for others that are struggling with that sense of where do I go from here, and losing faith and losing hope and being succumbing to that sense of learned helplessness, because we want to foster learned hopefulness in many people, and this is a useful way to do it. Daily, regularly, writing it down, seeing it on your tablets, seeing it on your laptop, seeing it on your cell phone, hearing it, speak to yourself, record yourself, find that motivational song, play it, because it's that attitude that we have to have, so that when we're responding to the current events, that we're doing so in a positive way, in a proactive way.
From what you, Mark, and Dave have said, I'm thinking of two things here. On the one hand, Dave, you mentioned honest, and I think that is such a key word in this idea of visionology and what we're trying to say. Be honest with yourself. come to terms with what's right, what's wrong, where you need to adjust. So that sense of honesty is so important. And then putting that honesty into practice comes with writing it down, hearing yourself say it. It's exactly what you were talking about, Mark.
What's coming up for me in dealing with these blockages and around the self-awareness and writing things down is to have an attitude of curiosity rather than judgment. Because I think, we can so easily hold ourselves in judgment and look at these blockages and criticize and make ourselves feel worse for feeling this way or for not achieving something. And so in order for the writing and the self-awareness and the working through your blockages and looking towards your vision, having an attitude of curiosity is so powerful to rather just ask, I wonder why I'm feeling this way, or I wonder why this is blocking me, or I wonder why that person's behaving in that way, as opposed to judging it as necessarily good or bad or right or wrong, and then being quite critical with ourselves. So the attitude of curiosity, I think, definitely fits into the concept of visionology, because are you going to see things through a lens of judgment or through curiosity? And I guess this is an invitation to be more curious, more inquiring just about yourself, about the world around you, and why you do the things you do and why people do the things they do, without overlaying it with a lens of judgment.
I like what you're saying, Lauren. I think there's healthy curiosity and unhealthy curiosity. For me, healthy curiosity is a curiosity paired with self-compassion.
Yeah.
Janelle, you were also saying earlier, we need to have that honest look at ourselves. The reality is, a lot of people looking at their current experience of the COVID-19 situation only sees struggle. That, unfortunately, is a reality for a lot of people. A lot of people who have lost loved ones, who have lost their jobs, who are in financial dire straits. For them, an honest look at their current situation is a struggle. So how do we engage with this reality with a sense of compassion? I think compassion for me is not just empathy with ourselves, but also that commitment that we can change it for the better. And I think looking at our current situation and realigning ourselves with our vision requires that recommitment. We said earlier in the conversation that we also want to talk about how we proactively respond to what our vision requires of us. And maybe at this point we need to say, we need to frame it as a recommitment. What are the actual steps that we can take? Mark, you said earlier that motivation should be a daily habit, and there's an idea of discipline behind that I really do like. I think enacting this recommitment to our life, to a version of my ideal self, requires us to practice certain core disciplines on a daily basis, whatever that means to you. Whether it is core disciplines within relationships, maintaining healthy relationships, maintaining daily routines, maintaining a renewed sense of recommitment to our vocation or our career. It requires that daily reminder that I am taking actual measurable steps forward.
When you say that, certain words that stick out for me are the words discipline, routines, habits, and I agree with all of them. But I know that for some people, there are little red alarm bells that go off because they dislike those terms. They don't like the word discipline. They don't like the word habit. They don't like the whole routine thing. It's just too much fuss and it's just too constraining. But when you were saying that, my retort would be to them is that, gravity happens whether you agree with it or not. So if my cell phone, if I let it go, it's going to go down. Okay, I caught that, so I didn't make a noise. Did you notice that? That was quite good. So let's do that again. So gravity, whether you agree with gravity or not, it works. You know, it's going to always go down. And I think the whole idea with discipline, with routine, and with habit, whether you like the terms or not, if you don't apply a degree of discipline, routine, habit in a proactive sense, you're not going to derive the benefit of it, and your life is going to be falling down like that cell phone. There we go. So thank you. That was a useful investment in the cell phone. But the point is that we have to take stock that there are certain daily habits that are either going to work for us or work against us. And as part of that proactive responding, we need to engage that level of commitment so that those possibilities don't just end up being frivolous hopes or expectations. They actually end up becoming that compass, that lighthouse for us, that navigational tool that will pull us forward, that will take us further.
Mark, I'm thinking of, when you say routine, I'm thinking also of routine and structure in parenting. So routine and structure is something that children thrive on to be able to develop adequately and to build their skills. Now, they might not necessarily like it, but it's good for them. And I think the same thing happens in our adult lives. It may not be something that we necessarily like the idea of, but like you say, some form of routine and structure in our life can really put us on a track where we develop optimally.
Mark, I'm very glad that you bring up this issue of the some people's possible aversion to the idea of discipline and routine and habits. And I often deal with this in therapy as well, when I have a sense that someone is against the idea of living by certain rules. Rules that they decide for themselves, by the way, but just the idea of rules. I think sometimes we like to be rule breakers, and just this idea of having to follow rules or follow structure doesn't sit well with us. My response to that is typically that on a neurobiological level, our brains are wired to automate processes. So whether we like to think about it or not, we develop habits. Think about learning how to drive. You know, at some stage you get to a point where you drive home from work and you park your car in front of your garage or inside your garage, and you close the door behind you and you sit there for a moment and you think to yourself, how on this good earth did I just get here? And the reason why we're able to have that moment of amnesia is because your brain basically, flicked on the autopilot when you got in the car and activated all those mechanisms and all those neural connections that had formed in the process of automating driving behavior. So we can develop good habits or we can develop bad habits. Either way, we are developing habits on a daily basis, whether you're consciously aware of it or whether you direct your behavior in that direction or not. Your brain is busy automating processes. So if you tell yourself discipline and following certain healthy routines and focusing my attention on positive behaviors, to me sounds too much like following the rules, then I'm saying you are developing habits of complacency. You are, without even knowing, developing certain habits that makes it more difficult for you to respond to challenges more proactively. So either way, we are in a process of gearing ourselves up for something, whether it is gearing ourselves up to align ourselves with a positive vision of our future, or gearing ourselves up with a sense of feeling lost.
I just wanted to say that, Dave, what you were saying links up with what Lauren was saying earlier about things can happen by default or by design. I liked her alliteration earlier on. And that's what you're saying is with with the habits. They're going to occur either by default or by design. And that reminded me of a very practical piece of advice that I heard from a leadership expert called John C. Maxwell. And he said that you should do this exercise. And what you need to do is you need to say, do it now, about 50 times when you wake up in the morning and 50 times before you go to bed at night. You don't have to say what that now is, but you say to yourself out loud, looking at yourself in the mirror, saying, do it now, 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 do it now. And you do that every single day for a month. And you ask why? Well, the reason is to be able to get out of a sense of complacency or procrastination, and those ideas that you have, those things that you're identifying that you need to be doing, you are going to be much better aligned, consciously and unconsciously, to do it now and to not let those things drift off your to-do list. And that's a part of that, not letting you drift by default, but by design, getting your neurobiology working for you, but you actually need to start programming that possibility for yourself.
I think when you say, those words, routine, discipline, habits, might not resonate with everybody. I guess what we're also saying is finding what works for you is so important, and finding what works for you and your family, because there is no right way to pandemic. Nobody's done this before. What we're sharing are things that we know generally help and help people through trauma and crisis. What's not helpful is to compare yourself to other people's routines and structures and habits that they're creating. So it's really about, again, it comes back to that self-connection piece, that self-awareness of what works for me. Because if you're going to set a goal or a structure to say, well, I'm going to exercise for an hour every day, 7 days a week, and then you don't get to do it, you're just going to feel worse about yourself. So it's finding something that's realistic. It's often just a small step. So it's a commitment to something really small that will help you get a little bit closer to where you want to go or the person you want to be. And then it's also constantly reevaluating that, because what I'm finding for myself and my clients through this pandemic is some of the stuff that worked a couple of weeks ago isn't working anymore. So we have to then say, okay, so maybe those exercise routines or that structure worked then, but now things have shifted again. So let's reevaluate and see what else do we need to put in place. But you can't make those decisions if you're not connected in with yourself and your family and finding what works for you.